As a lawyer, have you ever won an unbeatable case? About 20 years ago, I was representing an electric utility company that many years earlier maintained its headquarters in a rural area that subsequently became a very busy part of the city. In the early 80s, the headquarters building and several acres of property had grown in value, so the utility decided to sell the property and relocate to an area with less traffic and more room. The property was sold to an auto dealership pursuant to a lease purchase agreement with the understanding that after the 10-year term of the lease expired, the car dealership would pay the balance due and take title to the property. When the 10-year deadline arrived, the dealership began the process of obtaining the necessary financing required to pay off the balance. To no surprise, the lender conditioned its loan to the dealership on receipt of a clean environmental Phase 1 site assessment. I knew that was bad. In the years that the utility had owned the property and maintained its headquarters on the site, it was a common practice to bury trash and other objects on the property, many of which are now considered toxic. That was in the years before the PCBs found in numerous components of an electrical system, including capacitors and transformers, were understood to be carcinogens. When the results of the Phase 1 site assessment came in, it was ugly. Numerous indicators of the presence of contaminants dictated that a Phase 2 assessment and site cleanup would be required. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the existence of several buried dump sites, and the utility was faced with bearing the cost of a site cleanup or a breach of the leased purchase agreement and millions of dollars in damages. The site cleanup process began. The burial sites were excavated, the contaminants and contaminated soil were removed, and the excavation sites were backfilled with clean dirt. As the process went forward and the cost of the cleanup and remediation escalated, it occurred to me to check the utility's old liability insurance policies to see if there might be coverage for some of the cleanup expenses. I was able to locate policies for 1967, 1975. The utility entered into the lease purchase agreement in 1975. To no surprise, the policies had environmental contamination exclusions, and specifically coverage exclusions for environmental contamination of the insurance property caused by the insured, except, that is, the liability policy from 1969. For some reason, which I was never able to determine, the policy in effect in 1969 had no environmental exclusion for contamination caused by the insured, whether such contamination was a property of a third party or property of the insured. After finding that the 1969 policy did not contain the environmental contamination exclusion and satisfying myself, the coverage under the policy was provided on an occurrence basis. Coverage was provided for incidents that occurred during the policy period without regard to the passage of time between the incident, discovery of the incident, and the date of the claim. I explained to the CEO that we could file a claim under the 1969 policy. He was skeptical. Why would an insurance company pay for damage the utility caused itself over 20 years ago? But I insisted the policy's wording was on our side. Just then, a worker handed the CEO a rusty license plate from 1969, found at the bottom of one of the holes. It felt like a sign. I sent a demand letter to the insurance company, asking them to cover the $1.5 million cleanup cost. They ignored us, so we sued. The insurance company called our claim ridiculous, but admitted they didn't want to keep facing lawsuits over old policies. To avoid future risks, they offered to pay the full $2.1 million cleanup cost in exchange for a promise that the utility would never file another claim related to 1969. The CEO and I agreed it was a fair deal. His only words to me were, "Hurry." It was the craziest suit in which I was ever involved.